All right. Yeah, thanks again, Brian and Kara, for having me here. And as we mentioned, this talk is for the contributors block, and it's called All PRs Welcome. For now, the evolution of contribution standards as our project grew. So I won't bury the lead here and say that we aren't accepting PRs anymore, anything drastic like that, because that's a bit extreme. But it does mean that we have adjusted the way that we accept contributions, and that has changed over time. So as Brian and Kara mentioned, my name is Brandon Roberts. You can find me on Twitter at Brandon T. Roberts. I tweet about gifts, I talk about sports, and I just have fun in general there. So if you got a spare follow, you can give me one there. As I mentioned before, I work at Narwhal as a developer advocate. I'm also a Google developer expert, which means I've been in this Angular space. I've been in there for a while, so there's that. And of course, this is all about open source projects, and I am a maintainer on the NGRX project. So for the agenda for this talk, it's about contribution standards. And so I'm going to cover some history about the NGRX project, talk about contributor history, and contribution mechanisms that we've adopted along the way. So let you give me more information about that. So what is NGRX project? As I mentioned before, NGRX is a collection of libraries for building reactive Angular applications. The project is a community-run organization founded by former Angular core team member Rob Wormald, who came up with this idea after looking and seeing some of the needs in the Angular space and wanted to create a project around that. So, but before we get further into that, let's take a little trip back. I don't have fancy harps or anything, but let's get into a little story time about the NGRX project and kind of how we got here. As I mentioned before, we got involved really early in the project. I mean, myself and some of the other people that I'll mention in the talk, but Rob initially created the NGRX project over a weekend to combine the principles of Redux and RxJS for Angular. So kind of a mix of those two things. And it's an area that the Angular needed in that way. So me, back in those days, I didn't have a lot of open source experience. It was something I always wanted to do, and I definitely didn't have much experience as a maintainer of a project. So that was definitely something new that I had to or wanted to get into. This is a picture of me and my buddy Mike. We used to work together, and we built a similar project to the first project when NGRX was NGRX Store internally at work. But we couldn't open source the project. And like I mentioned before, I always wanted to contribute to open source. And because of those two things kind of being there at that moment, we decided to start contributing to this project. I think Mike maybe started a little bit prior to me, but we moved towards to creating this project, wanted to get it open source, and we started from there. This is a relatively old pic, so if you see the differences there are some. I know I see them. So you know what happens at the beginning when you're at the beginning of the project and people have lots of ideas and not a lot of time. There's usually no shortage of people who want to contribute to open source projects. So that's what we did. We started opening a bunch of PRs. We started doing a lot of work, started contributing to the project. And that just kind of became our thing more and more over time. So there was the initial team of people on the NGRX project. Like I said, me and Mike started contributing PRs. So eventually we were invited to join the project and started maintaining like the day-to-day activities for the project. Just as issues, PRs. Like I said, we had done those things that you start out as a contributor on many other open source projects. So as I mentioned before, I hadn't done much open source work before. So, and we had a steady flow of contributors with different skill sets, of course. And so then my old friend comes out, and I think we know who that person is. Imposter syndrome. Um, I was new to maintaining an open source project. People were contributing. Part of me didn't want to turn down contributions because it's uh, it's a challenge, to get up the effort to put that work in, but also at the same time, not everything, at least it wasn't apparent to me that not everything people wanted to add should be added to the framework. So there was a bit of a compromise there. I could definitely say that our contribution standards weren't as nearly as strong as in the initial, or as strong now as they were in the beginning of the project. But I quickly learned, I think other people on the team learn also, that once you have these public APIs, they're there, forever. So you definitely have to take more time in in the long term of what you want to have in your project. So as usage of the project continued to grow in the ecosystem, there are many people started using it in their projects. It started getting a lot more adoption. It started being used inside Google, which gave us more momentum. Just the project just started to spread across the Angular ecosystem really rapidly. So not only did our project grow, but our team grew in the same way over time. As I mentioned before, me and Mike were contributors that, early contributors that became maintainers. And we also added other people to the team over time and added additional libraries over time also. So that goes into how do we up our contribution standards to keep up with everything, because we still wanted to accept contributions, but we were at a point where we couldn't be as flexible just because we wanted to maintain that level of support and consistency that our users were accustomed to. So at the end of the day, we wanted to stick to the vision of the framework, of NGRX, the framework. And our contribution standards would help us facilitate that. So what is the vision that we have for the NGRX framework? And it was good, like I said, good to get these things out earlier, in hindsight, to have these things like codified out earlier. But we wanted our libraries to have a small footprint, that way that when you're adding these NGRX libraries to your app, you're not paying a significant cost there. We want a small, concise API with not a bunch of additional concepts to learn, just because on top of the framework itself, we have, there's some things to learn there. We also want developers to build on top of the framework. So making it a good solid core that people can build on top of and extend from there. And above all else, we want it to be type safe. So we want to maximize type safety for consumers of our APIs. So we move towards a more standardized process with a contribution process to standardize on these things. And we did this in 3 main ways. And these are somewhat common in the when maintaining projects, but we use RFCs, which I'll talk about. Included with those RFCs are design docs, if we get to that far, or design docs based on RFCs, and doubling down on TypeScript, because all of our libraries are built on that particular stack. So RFCs. For those who may not know, RFCs that we use are requests for comments. But RFCs provide us a place in the issues where we can have a discussion about a potential feature or a particular issue that users are having. So we can have that conversation early and often up front to make sure that we're, have everything covered there. It's also a place for collaboration about changes that go along with, like I said, go along with that discussion, or even a place for closure. And I'm pretty sure there'll be other talks from maintainers of how you handle these things. So those are places to discuss that also. About closure being that maybe it's something that we're not looking to add, but like I said, that'll be discussed more. We also talked about, also mentioned design documents. So when I say design docs, we aren't expecting, super long pages of design documents that, people just kind of get lost in. But we do have a few things that are included in those design docs, such as an objective, goals, designs, like I said, minimal designs, and then extended designs to go for those things that we want to achieve. Impact to our current users and features and users, because we definitely want to support them at the end of the day. And possible alternatives. And we have like a formal document that's, like I said, it's usually try to make it a one pager, not too much going on there, but just provides more consistency for us and in that process, just so we ensure a level of quality that we're aiming for. The last thing I mentioned was TypeScript. I mean, all of our TypeScript is all the hype these days. So we're definitely on top of that, standing on top of that foundation there. But we have of course, our battery of tests for unit test integration. Those suite of tests. I think most of us have those. We always strive to have stricter types, but not to the point of like hampering developers using them. So we leverage TypeScript. We use those types as much as possible to our advantage and to our users' advantage. And we also have what I call inference tests, where we validate the inferred types from TypeScript from a consumer standpoint so that we don't accidentally break anyone. Because like I said, once you maintain a project for a while and you have a good number of users, those are things that we value very heavily. So even with all that, our contribution standards did grow, but we still have a good growing number of contributors, which I'm really excited about to help us achieve the goals of NGRX and the just open source ecosystem around Angular, and then helping those other maintainers grow in that space. So just a quick recap. Talked about NGRX the project, our contributor history, and kind of how the things that we learned along the process of I learned along the process of maintaining the project, contribution mechanisms that we use to facilitate those contributions, and also keep those standards in line with the goals that we have for the project. Once again, thanks for having me, and I look forward to the rest of the summit.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Brandon. Appreciate you walking through that framework. And it's always nice to know like what steps you should be expecting when walking the project and how contributions are expected. So I appreciate you walking through that. And it's good insight for anybody who wants to make contributions. Perhaps other projects have similar sort of flags in the ground to say, hey, this is how to contribute here.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And of course, in hindsight, all those things are like, yeah, these things would have been easier had I known some of these things up front. But sometimes those best lessons are learned through practice. So,
yeah. Yeah, for sure. Open source is all about the friends we make along the way. And yeah. Speaking of friends, I just wanted to make a quick shout out in our framework on the website, which you go to maintainnerds.com or the actual proper website, which is globalmaintainersummit.github.com. We do have a code of conduct. So if you are interested in how to basically keep this environment safe, especially GatherTown safe, we encourage you to check that out. Please review that as you walk around GatherTown and keep that in mind. But also, you can find the schedule. You can also find links to the maintainers and links to their profiles. So if you do want to sponsor them, please, by all means, hang out with them, sponsor them, learn about what they're working on.